Just a temp nurse. That is what Dr. Prescott said at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, his voice carrying across the empty ER like he was announcing the weather. 15 seconds later, Rachel Torres walked through those doors, discount scrubs, worn clogs, a pair of frayed dog tags hidden beneath her collar, and the room would never be the same again. They didn't know she'd spent 2 tours running trauma under mortar fire. They didn't know that the scar on her forearm came from shrapnel at Bagram, or that every movement she made was muscle memory grooved into her nervous system by 12 years of field medicine. What was about to unfold would take 2 years to surface. But that Tuesday morning, nobody was watching for a hero. Nobody was looking for one. Valley Memorial's emergency department opened with the smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee, fluorescent lights reflecting off polished floors so clean they looked sterile. The shift was starting. Monitors beeped in their fractional rhythms. For stands waited in corners like steel sentinels. Rachel moved through the space with mechanical precision, her hands never hesitating, her eyes cataloging everything, patient positions, oxygen saturation numbers on display screens, the exact moment a cardiac monitor would require attention. She wore scrubs bought at a discount outlet for $14.99, and they were 2 sizes too loose because she bought them to disappear into, not to stand out from. The supply cart rolled beneath her fingers with practiced efficiency. She organized equipment the way she'd once organized field surgical kits under the iron percussion of distant explosions, every item in its exact position, redundancy built in, nothing wasted. Gauze by grade. Sutures by thickness. Airway equipment arranged so even in darkness her hands would find what they needed. A trauma nurse watching from 3 feet away would think nothing of this. She would see a woman restocking supplies. Rachel saw the placement as a sentence, "This is who I am, if you know how to read it." Her locker stood open near the nursing station. Inside, on the bottom shelf beneath her gym bag and a spare shirt, sat the combat boots. Leather cracked from desert heat. Laces frayed and stiff. The rubber sole worn thin on the left heel from 847 hours of standing, she'd counted once, at 3 a.m., unable to sleep. The boots had walked through Fallujah during the winter of 2008. They'd stood in the field hospital at Bagram during the siege of 2011. They were the only thing from her past life that she'd kept. Everything else had been burned in a ceremony she never talked about, sealed in a box marked classified, filed away with the rest of Major Rachel Torres, USMC. Morning rounds in 3 minutes, someone called from the hallway. Rachel closed her locker without looking back. Dr. Prescott arrived at 6:52 a.m., his white coat pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that whispered money and confidence. He moved through the ER like a man who'd never been questioned, his eyes moving across equipment and personnel with the casual assessment of someone appraising assets. When he got to Rachel, organizing the central supply drawer with her back to him, his gaze lingered exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to dismiss her. Long enough to register, temp. Young. Female. Not a threat to anything that mattered. Just a temp nurse, he said to the resident shadowing him, his voice just loud enough for the nurse's station to hear. They come through here like weather systems. 3 weeks and they're gone. Good for filling gaps. Nothing more. The resident laughed on cue. The other nurses, 6 of them, a mix of full-time and contract, said nothing. Rachel's hands kept moving. Drawer closed. Eyes up. Her face was a professional mask, the kind you learn to wear when you'd spent 2 years making life-or-death decisions and had to hide that from people who'd never understand. She had a 14-year-old son named Marcus, waiting at home. He was the reason she'd left the Marines. He was the reason she'd become a temp nurse instead of staying with the Navy Medical Corps, instead of taking the accelerated promotion to attending surgeon that the Pentagon had offered before she'd submitted her resignation. Marcus had been 6 the last time she'd deployed. 7 the time after that. By the time he turned 8, she'd watched him pack a bag without crying, pack a bag like it was routine, like having a mother come and go was just something that happened to children whose parents served. She'd held his hand at the airport and felt him go rigid, pulling away from the goodbye embrace, and that was when she knew. That was when she understood that some forms of sacrifice weren't noble, they were just loss. So she'd come home to Denver. She'd gotten certified as an RN. She'd taken temp position so she could keep her schedule flexible enough to be at soccer games and school conferences and the ordinary moments that her son deserved. The cost was her career. The cost was silence about what she'd done and who she'd been. The cost was wearing scrubs from a discount outlet and organizing supply carts while people like Prescott talked past her as if she was part of the furniture. Morning rounds began at 7:04 a.m. in Trauma Bay 2, where a 58-year-old male had come in overnight with chest pain and elevated troponin. The team gathered, Prescott leading, the resident and 2 interns trailing. Rachel stood at the monitor station, watching the EKG, watching the numbers. BP 156/94. Heart rate 118. O2 sat 94%. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She read the data like a language. Prescott was talking. Differential diagnosis, he said. Likely stable angina, he said. Let's trend the next troponin, he said, maybe cardiology consultation. The resident nodded. The interns wrote notes. And Rachel, standing motionless at the monitor, saw what he'd missed. The EKG showed a subtle ST elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF. The pattern was unmistakable if you knew how to look for it. Inferior wall myocardial infarction. Not stable. Not trending. Active. Right now. The patient's troponin hadn't been mildly elevated, it had been 2.8 nanograms per milliliter. Acute. Doctor, Rachel said. Her voice was quiet. Controlled. The kind of control that comes from having to sound composed while giving orders under fire. The EKG. Prescott turned. His expression made it clear that she'd interrupted something that didn't require interruption from a temp nurse reading a monitor. The ST elevation, she said. Still quiet. Inferior wall. His troponin from 6 a.m. was 2.8. A moment passed. The kind of moment where competence either exposes arrogance or it doesn't. Prescott looked at the EKG. Looked at the monitor. Looked at the patient, who suddenly seemed less stable than he had 30 seconds ago. The resident was already reaching for the phone. Cardiology. Cath lab. Stat. The kind of call that happened when you recognized an active MI instead of missing it entirely. Good catch, Prescott said, his voice sharp and clipped, the words landing like a knife being put back into its sheath. He didn't look at Rachel. He was already moving to the next patient, the next round, the next opportunity to be the smartest person in the room. But she'd seen something in his face. A flash. A recognition. She'd made his oversight visible. Visible to the resident. Visible to the interns. Visible to the nurses standing nearby. And that kind of visibility, in a hospital where hierarchy was everything, was a dangerous thing to create. The shift moved forward. Patients came and went. Ambulances arrived with their sirens announcing urgency. The antiseptic smell mixed with something else, the sharp copper of blood, the sour edge of sickness, the flat chemical taste of fear that lived in the air of every emergency room. Rachel moved through it all with the same mechanical precision, her hands working, her eyes cataloguing, her voice steady when it needed to be. But in the hallway near the med room, she caught Prescott watching her. Not observing her work. Watching her. The way a predator watches something that's gotten too close to its territory. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. And in that moment, Rachel understood something that would become increasingly clear over the next few weeks. She'd made a mistake. Not in catching his error. In letting him see that she'd caught it. In making it impossible for him to pretend it hadn't happened. What happened next didn't change anything immediately. The shift ended at 2 p.m. Rachel clocked out, drove home through Denver's afternoon traffic, picked up her son from soccer practice, and sat at the kitchen table while he talked about the team's record and an upcoming tournament. He had her dark eyes. Her steady hands. Her way of moving through the world like he was assessing everything without needing to speak about what he saw. He was 14. He didn't know his mother had once commanded a trauma unit. He didn't know about Bagram. He knew she was a nurse. He knew she worked odd hours. He knew she was always home for the important moments. That was enough. But while Rachel sat across from her son eating leftover lasagna and listening about a game she wouldn't be able to attend next week because of her shifts, something was changing at Valley Memorial. Something was setting in motion. Dr. Prescott was making calls. Not obvious calls. Not aggressive calls. Just the kind of administrative conversations that doctors have with other doctors, conversations about staffing efficiency, about protocol enforcement, about the importance of maintaining standards. He was building infrastructure. The kind of infrastructure that could take down someone who'd embarrassed him. She had no idea yet. But he was already moving. Already planning. Already deciding that the temp nurse with her cheap scrubs and her scary competence and her ability to see what he'd missed was going to pay for that moment in Trauma Bay 2. The silence before a storm sounds like nothing. It sounds like Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., a man dismissing a woman he's never bothered to really see, a supply cart being restocked with supplies organized by someone who'd once organized life-saving equipment under siege conditions. It sounds like a hospital room. It sounds like routine. It sounds like nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Rachel didn't even know the storm was coming. The cafeteria fell silent at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Rachel Torres learned the precise moment when a calculated smile became a weapon. Dr. Prescott stood in the center of the packed dining area during shift change, speaking loud enough for 3 full rotations of nursing staff to hear. 200 people between the salad bar and the coffee station. He wore his stethoscope like a sash of authority, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a hospital setting. "I'm taking bets," he announced, his eyes finding Rachel in the food line. "How long until the temp girl quits?" "I give her a week. Maybe less." Laughter rippled through the room, nervous, complicit laughter from nurses who didn't want to be next. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. All eyes shifted to the woman holding a lunch tray at the far end of the buffet line. Rachel stood motionless for 3 seconds. She met his gaze, cold, flat, the kind of stare that comes from having already survived worse. Then she turned, took her tray to an empty table in the corner, and ate her sandwich while every nurse in the room found suddenly urgent reasons to examine their phones. Prescott smiled. He'd drawn blood on the first strike. The humiliation campaign didn't escalate loudly after that. It became surgical. Systematic. He was too competent to simply yell at her or give direct orders. Instead, he weaponized hospital protocol the way a surgeon weaponizes a scalpel, with precision, documentation, and deniability. Over the next 5 days, Rachel stabilized 3 patients in the ER. A diabetic in metabolic crisis, a man with acute appendicitis, a woman whose blood pressure had tanked from a silent GI bleed. She caught each one before full decompensation, adjusted interventions, documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her tenure here was conditional. Each patient began to improve. Color returning. Vitals stabilizing. The kind of quiet victories that happen in emergency medicine when someone knows what they're doing. Prescott watched every single one. Within 4 hours of each stabilization, he reassigned her patients to less experienced nurses. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. Just a shift reassignment in the system, a quiet word to the charge nurse. Rachel would arrive at her patient's bed to find that the 6 p.m. assessment was already done by someone else, that the fluid orders had been changed, that she'd have to re-establish rapport and re-document everything from the beginning. The efficiency of her handoff, the continuity of care she'd built, erased. The message was wordless but unmistakable, her clinical competence was a threat to be neutralized. During Wednesday morning rounds, a patient Rachel had flagged for respiratory distress lay in Bay 2, his oxygen saturation trending downward, his breathing becoming shallow. She documented it twice. She'd mentioned it to the charge nurse. She'd left specific notes about monitoring. When Prescott arrived with his entourage, she presented the case. Clearly. With vital signs, with timeline, with her clinical concern stated plainly, I'm watching his SATs. I think we should order a chest X-ray and check his arterial blood gas. Prescott glanced at the monitor without approaching the bed. Nurses observe, Torres. They don't diagnose. Your job is to report numbers, not interpret them. The sting was calculated. Professional on its surface. Condescending underneath. Rachel's jaw tightened, visible to anyone watching, which several residents were. 53 seconds later, after Prescott had moved to the next patient, he turned back. Actually, let's get a chest X-ray on that one. And an ABG. Good catch, Torres. The second humiliation tasted like ash. On Friday, during the chaos of the 2 p.m. shift change when the cafeteria was loudest and fullest, Rachel carried her lunch tray through the crowd. 200 staff members moving between shifts, conversations at full volume, the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the industrial dishwasher creating white noise that masked individual voices. She didn't see Prescott until his elbow caught the edge of her tray. It wasn't a bump. It wasn't accidental. His arm extended deliberately, and her tray, sandwich, apple, water bottle, carefully balanced, launched into the air. Food scattered across the tile floor like shrapnel. The plastic clattered loud enough to punch through the crowd noise. 50 staff members froze mid-conversation. Watch where you're going, temp, Prescott said, not bothering to look at her. Rachel crouched. She picked up every piece, the sandwich broken into halves, the apple that had rolled under a table, the plastic wrapper, the water bottle that had spilled across 3 tiles. No one helped. No one even offered. The conversations resumed around her, voices stepping over her presence like water flowing around a stone. She was a problem solved, a cautionary tale, someone not quite real enough to be worth defending. She stood, balanced the ruined meal in her hands, and walked to the trash with her back straight and her movements precise. Every muscle locked. But her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She was made of stronger stuff than humiliation, though no one in that cafeteria knew it. That came later. The real architect of her isolation was subtler. Prescott began burying her incident reports in bureaucratic channels that didn't actually exist. She filed a report about understaffing in trauma during night shift. It got forwarded to a staffing assessment committee that met quarterly and had no authority over emergency department allocation. She documented a near-miss medication error by another nurse. It landed in a folder marked quality review that would stay in storage for months, never reaching the person who could actually do something about it. Her reports about broken monitoring equipment, about outdated crash cart supplies, about a visiting physician who'd made inappropriate comments to staff, all of them disappeared into the same bureaucratic purgatory. The message was clear: her voice didn't matter. Her documentation didn't matter. She was a temp. Temporary things eventually leave. On Friday evening, with the shift running hot and 3 ambulances inbound, Rachel had organized the patient charts at the nurses' station with the efficiency that came from 17 years of triage experience. Critical cases in one stack, organized by acuity. Routine follow-ups in another. Discharge paperwork separate. It was a system that had saved precious seconds all week, that let whoever was running the station grab exactly what they needed without hunting through 3 different piles. Prescott arrived, saw the organization, and understood exactly what it meant: evidence of competence. Evidence of leadership? Evidence that the temp girl wasn't temporary at all, she was embedded, necessary, and making his emergency department run better than it had in months. His arm swept across the entire stack. 200 sheets of paper scattered across the tile floor, sliding under equipment, disappearing under the nurse's station, creating chaos where there had been order. The sound was sharp, the percussion of institutional collapse in miniature. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the entire emergency department. Rachel stood motionless. The room went dead silent. Not gradually. All at once. Conversation stopped. Monitors seemed to beep louder. The ventilator in the corner wheezed its mechanical rhythm into an audience of 40 people watching to see what the temp nurse would do. 5 seconds. 10. The silence stretched like a taut cable. Then Rachel's voice cut through the room, not loud, not angry, but carrying the weight of surgical precision. Your ex-wife was right about you. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Prescott red-faced and trembling, his hands clenching and unclenching, his mouth opening and closing around words that wouldn't come. She delivered the truth like a diagnosis, and the room had heard every word. 20 minutes later, the emergency dispatch radio crackled to life. Valley Memorial, this is Flight Medicine Transport. We've got a critical inbound from Bagram. Marine IED injury, catastrophic trauma to torso and lower extremities. Been unconscious 31 hours. ETA 12 minutes. The ER mobilized like a single organism. Trauma Bay 3 was prepped, monitors switched on, for line staged, blood products cross-matched and ready. The surgical team was notified. Respirator settings were adjusted. Everything moved with the choreography of a department that had run this dance hundreds of times. Prescott arrived in Trauma Bay 3 and began assigning roles with territorial precision. He was claiming this case. This was his patient, his save, his department. Rachel wasn't assigned initially. The assignment sheet went to 2 senior nurses, both of them competent, both of them accustomed to following Prescott's lead without question. The ambulance arrived at 12:59 p.m. The paramedics moved with controlled urgency, their voices crisp and professional as they delivered the handoff. Male, 47 years old, multiple IED-related injuries, intubated in field, sedated for transport, blood pressure unstable. Rachel was standing at the entrance to the bay when they wheeled the stretcher through. She saw his face and stopped breathing. Every muscle in her body locked. Her hand gripped the metal rail beside the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned white. The patient's features were partially obscured by the ventilator apparatus, by the oxygen mask, by the trauma, but there was no question. No possibility of mistake. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Torres. The man who'd called her twice during her son's deployment to reassure her before official channels had a chance to reach her. The commanding officer who'd kept her boy alive through ambushes and firefights and the kind of violence that ordinary mothers don't let themselves imagine. The man her son would have followed into hell, and probably had. No one noticed her hands trembling. The room was chaos, monitors being connected, for lines being established, Prescott barking orders with the authority of a man who believed his voice was the law. Rachel moved into the bay. Her personal crisis became a professional one, locked away in the vault where she kept the rest of her history. Her face became a mask. Her hands became steady. She was exactly what Valley Memorial thought she was, a temp nurse, competent but temporary, here to follow orders and ask no questions. She began the trauma assessment with the efficiency of someone who'd performed triage in field hospitals under mortar fire. Vitals. Pupil response. Breath sounds. Her fingers moved across Marcus's chest, cataloging injuries, documenting findings, her clinical eye operating at a level that made the senior nurses move out of her way without being asked. Prescott noticed. Of course he did. His eyes followed her hands like a predator tracking movement. His tablet emerged. He began time-stamping, documenting, photographing her interactions with the patient. Building a trail. Creating evidence. Rachel was too focused to see it. She was checking Marcus's trachea, the alignment, the midline position, when she noticed the deviation. Subtle. Early. But unmistakable. A tension pneumothorax. Air accumulating in the chest cavity, collapsing one lung, pushing the heart toward the other side. Growing by the minute. The clock had already started. The chart scattered like snow across the nurse's station. 18 pages minimum. Patient vitals, medication schedules, DNR orders, 4 hours of careful organization atomized in 3 seconds. Dr. Prescott's hand was still raised, trembling slightly from the force of the throw. His face had gone the color of raw meat. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt usually reserved for roaches found in surgical instruments. Rachel stood motionless 3 feet away. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes tracked the scattered pages. One had landed in spilled coffee, the ink already bleeding. She could feel the weight of the ER around her. The nurses pretending not to watch. The residents frozen mid-task. The phlebotomist holding a specimen cup like it might explode. The room had that quality of held breath, the moment before a defibrillator paddle makes contact. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. Not anger that showed. Anger that had achieved critical density and gone absolutely still, like uranium approaching criticality. Her jaw was clenched so tight the muscle beneath her skin looked carved from marble. Her breathing was slow. Measured. The kind of breathing taught in combat medicine courses under the heading stress inoculation. Prescott watched her, waiting for the reaction he'd choreographed. The tears. The retreat to a supply closet. The fumbling apology. That's what happened when you humiliated a temp nurse in front of 3 shifts. That's what happened when someone had no power, no recourse, no voice. He didn't see her hands curl into fists so slowly they made no sound. Your ex-wife was right about you. Rachel's voice came out like a scalpel. Thin. Sharp. Precise. Every word separated from the next like surgical stitches. She told people exactly what you were. Turns out, she was the only one paying attention. Prescott's face went from red to purple. His mouth opened and closed twice like a fish on a deck. Rachel turned on her heel and walked away from him, her movements controlled and unhurried. She didn't retrieve the charts. Didn't apologize. Didn't even look back. She moved through the ER like she was walking through a place that no longer had the power to touch her, and every eye followed her path toward the medication dispensary. Prescott stood alone among the scattered pages, his hands still trembling, his breath coming in short bursts through his nose. He opened his mouth to say something, to order her back, to threaten her, to reassert the hierarchy that had just inverted in front of 20 witnesses, but nothing came. The silence stretched until it had weight. Until it had become a verdict. A young resident named Chen stepped forward and began gathering the papers. 2 nurses joined her. Nobody looked at Prescott. Nobody acknowledged him. The ER reorganized itself around his absence as if he'd already left the building. Rachel's hands did shake now, in the medication room, doors closed, where nobody could see. She braced herself against the counter and let her breathing reach its baseline. 60 seconds. 90. She thought about the combat boots in her locker, the one she'd worn in Bagram, the one she'd worn over dust still mixed with shrapnel from a Chinook that had landed too close to the trauma tent during a mass casualty event 3 years ago. She thought about the woman she'd been before Denver, before the lie of being a temp nurse, before she decided that being someone's mother meant burying the other half of herself. She had 7 minutes of her shift remaining. 7 minutes to finish her current patient care, chart her notes, and begin the process of becoming invisible again. She didn't have 7 minutes. The radio crackled at 1,453 hours. Dispatch. The voice was clipped, professional, carrying the particular cadence of military medical protocol being transmitted through civilian channels. Valley Memorial ER, this is aeromedical dispatch. Incoming fixed-wing transport. Military medical evacuation from Bagram Airfield. Male, 47 years old, blunt force trauma to the thoracic cavity with suspected hemopneumothorax. Vitals en route, BP 108/68, trending down. Heart rate 119 and climbing. Respiratory rate 24, shallow. Oxygen saturation 92% on 2 liters. ETA 12 minutes. The ER shifted. Not panicked. Something more organized than panic. This was the rhythm that happened when the stakes became visible. When the patient wasn't a car accident or a fall or a weekend drunk, when they were the kind of casualty that required specific knowledge, specific equipment, specific people. Rachel's head came up. Her eyes went distant for 1/4 of a second. The kind of look people got when they were doing rapid calculations in a language the rest of the world didn't speak. Major Dr. James Halliran, the senior attending on the trauma side, was already moving. He was good, smart, measured, respected. The kind of physician who remembered that knowledge without humility was just arrogance with credentials. He began calling the team. Trauma surgery. Anesthesia. The fastest OR nurse in the building. He called for the level 1 rapid infuser and blood products pre-positioned. Military evac, he was saying into his phone. Thoracic trauma. Possible tension physiology. Prepare for emergency decompression. He paused, listening. Yes, at Valley Memorial in Denver. I understand the unusual vector. This is a combat medicine presentation, so assume worst case until we rule it out. The ER began its transformation. Trauma Bay 3 was being readied, equipment checked, monitors tested, resuscitation drugs laid out in their predetermined sequence. Someone was pulling imaging protocols for penetrating thoracic injury. Someone else was calling the hospital blood bank to start thawing O-negative units. Rachel moved toward the main trauma bay without being assigned. Her movements had changed. The careful deference, the head-down posture of the temp nurse trying not to be noticed, that had been replaced by something else entirely. The way she moved now was the way people moved when they'd walked into operating theaters under shellfire. The way muscles moved when trained responses had been fired thousands of times. She was pulling on a fresh pair of gloves when she passed Dr. Prescott in the hallway. He was heading toward Trauma Bay 3, his face carrying the expression of a man who'd just been reminded that the world contained threats he didn't understand. His eyes met Rachel's for 1/4 of a second. He saw something there that made him stop walking. That made him reassess whatever he'd been about to say. He didn't say anything. The team assembled in Trauma Bay 3. Hallie ran. 2 residents. A trauma surgeon named Dr. Patricia Chen who'd trained in military medicine during her fellowship and still held a reserve commission. 2 ICU nurses. Rachel. 1 anesthesia team standing by with intubation equipment and induction drugs. The room had that quality of organized electricity, every person stationed, every piece of equipment positioned, every contingency already accounted for in the minds of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. The helicopter was 7 minutes out. The dispatch message had come through again with updated vitals, BP 10/66. Heart rate 132. Oxygen saturation 89% despite the supplemental oxygen. The patient was deteriorating. Rachel stood on the left side of the trauma bay, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes on the monitor screen. She was waiting for something. Everyone else was preparing. She was waiting. There was a difference. The sound of the helicopter rotors didn't come yet, but the ER felt it coming the way the body feels the approach of a storm system, a pressure change in the air, a sense of altitude shifting, gravity doing something it didn't normally do. And in that moment of perfect stillness before the doors would burst open and the world would stop being theoretical, Rachel felt the ghost of the woman she'd been materialize behind her like breath on glass. The woman who'd worn combat boots through blood that wasn't hers. The woman who'd made life and death decisions in the dark. The woman her son had believed was a nurse, when she'd actually been a soldier, and the distinction had seemed important then. She had for minutes. The stretcher burst through the trauma bay doors at 14:47, and Rachel knew before the paramedics finished their report. Catastrophic injuries. Flail chest. Possible tension pneumothorax. The patient's face was swollen beyond recognition, but she heard his call sign in the paramedic's voice, the urgency reserved for someone important. Someone command cared about. The man on the stretcher was barely breathing. His chest rose in shallow, desperate pulls, asymmetrical, one side barely moving. His oxygen saturation flickered on the monitor, 89. Then 84. The monitor's beep accelerated like a predator closing in. Dr. Prescott wasn't in the trauma bay yet, he was still finishing rounds 3 floors up. That meant Rachel had maybe 90 seconds before protocol demanded his presence, and she could already hear the man's breathing changing, becoming something wrong, becoming the sound of lungs collapsing inward. The patient's trachea was visibly deviated. Rachel saw it the moment the trauma team transferred him from stretcher to table, the windpipe shifting to the right side of his neck, a physical landscape of catastrophe. His breathing had become agonal, irregular, each intake a gasp like he was drowning in air. The oxygen saturation dropped again. 78, the alarm screamed its electronic warning across the bay, a sound like a warning siren that made every nerve in her body ignite. Tension pneumothorax, Rachel said quietly, not to anyone, just to the patient, just to the body in front of her that was suffocating from the inside out. The other nurses looked at her. One of them, Sarah, newer, 3 months into her first ER rotation, said, "Dr. Prescott's on his way down." Prescott was always on his way. Prescott would arrive in 30 seconds and take his time establishing a chest tube, and the patient would lose consciousness at 22 seconds of oxygen deprivation, and cardiac arrest would follow at 45. Rachel's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from Bagram's trauma unit, where the difference between life and death was not bureaucracy, not hierarchy, not waiting for an attending who moved like a man who'd never seen a body die in front of him. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. The metal was cool against her palm, familiar as the weight of a sidearm. No time for full sterile protocol. No time for the dual physician approval that Hospital Policy Manual Section 7.3.2 required for needle decompression in non-combat settings. No time for Prescott's permission, which he would have refused anyway because denying her was the only power he had left that mattered to him. Rachel positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks without thinking, the ribs like a map she'd navigated in war, through dust storms and mortar fire, through hours when breath was the only thing that separated living Marines from body bags. She pressed the needle through skin, through fascia, through the pleural space, and then came the sound that meant life, the hiss of air escaping, the pneumothorax releasing its deadly pressure like a confession. Oxygen saturation climbed. 82, the monitor's frantic beeping slowed. 88, 91. The patient's breathing steadied almost immediately, his body recognizing that he could draw air now, that his lungs were expanding, that the pressure crushing his chest had released like hands unclenching. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he stared at Rachel's face, and she saw recognition flicker across his features, saw him trying to place where he knew her from. Sinus rhythm, she said to the trauma team, though they'd already seen it on the monitor, the heart's rhythm returning to something that looked like normal, that looked like survival. She placed a finger on his wrist and felt the pulse steady beneath her skin, felt the arterial thump of a body that had narrowly avoided death, that had been pulled back from the edge by a single intervention and 30 seconds of time. The room's tension released like air from a lung. One of the nurses, Marcus's intake nurse, let out a breath she'd been holding, and Sarah actually closed her eyes like she was saying a prayer. Rachel secured the needle with tape, hand steady, movements precise, the kind of precision that came from having done this in a trauma tent while mortars fell outside and blood dried under fingernails. Then the doors opened. Dr. Prescott entered at 14:47 and 30 seconds, his entrance like a dark cloud moving across the sun. He stopped. He looked at the monitor showing stable vital signs. He looked at the secured needle. He looked at Rachel. And Rachel watched his face recalibrate, watched him process that the patient he'd been rushing to save was no longer dying, that the crisis had been resolved, that his moment to demonstrate superiority had evaporated. What happened here? His voice was dangerously quiet. Tension pneumothorax, Sarah said. Major Torres, she caught herself, quickly corrected. The nurse performed a needle decompression. He stabilized immediately. Prescott's jaw clenched. He looked at Rachel like she'd committed a violation of his personal property, like her competence was a theft from his authority. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just moved to the patient's side and examined the needle with the expression of a man searching for a flaw in an otherwise solid work, the way a predator examines prey that had somehow escaped. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next was far more calculated, far more dangerous, because Prescott didn't scream or rage. Instead, he turned to a resident standing at the foot of the bed and said, "Document this. Unauthorized invasive procedure. I want a full report on my desk within the hour." Then he looked at Rachel with eyes like ice, and said, "You're a nurse, not a surgeon. You don't get to play hero." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't explain. She didn't defend the decision that had taken 30 seconds and saved a life that the hospital would later discover was a Marine officer with command presence and connections that reached far beyond Valley Memorial's walls. She simply nodded once, acknowledging that she'd heard him, and then she turned away to document the procedure with meticulous precision, knowing exactly what was coming, knowing that Prescott had already begun building his case, that by the time this shift ended she would be unemployed. By 3 p.m., Prescott had filed an incident report citing protocol violation. By 15:30, he'd cross-referenced hospital policy and her personnel file, highlighting her temp status and lack of Colorado-specific trauma certifications. By 4 p.m., he'd collected witness statements from 3 nurses, each one confirming that the procedure had been performed without attending physician approval, each one technically accurate and absolutely weaponized. By 5 p.m., he'd presented administration with a documentation trail thick enough to constitute grounds for immediate termination. Rachel finished her shift in silence, aware of Prescott's eyes on her like a predator marking wounded prey. She moved through the ER with the efficiency of someone who knew these were her final hours in this place, and she documented everything, every vital sign, every intervention, every decision. The meticulousness of her charting was almost defiant, because Prescott would use it as evidence against her, and she knew that, and she wrote anyway. At 18:47, as the evening shift was taking over, Prescott intercepted her in the parking lot. The Denver sky was turning dark at the edges, the sun dropping behind the mountains like a sinking ship. The parking lot lights were harsh, clinical, the kind of lighting that made everything look aggressive. Prescott had brought witnesses, an administrator Rachel didn't recognize, and a security guard with uncomfortable body language. He walked toward her like a man who'd finally gotten what he wanted, an audience, and a moment, and the power to speak without interruption. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," he said. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone reading from a prepared script, though his eyes burned with the satisfaction of a man whose contempt had finally been validated by institutional authority. Protocol violation. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Lack of appropriate certifications. You're a nurse, Torres, not a surgeon. You don't get to play hero in my hospital. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him for a moment, let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the security guard shifted his weight and the administrator glanced away, and then she said, "I didn't save his life to impress you." One sentence. Surgical. Final. She turned and walked toward her car, her boots loud on the pavement, and she didn't look back because looking back would have given him the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed a blow. The drive home was silent except for the road beneath the tires. Denver's evening traffic moved around her like water around a stone. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel, but when she turned onto her street and pulled into her driveway, something in her chest released. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at the pair of worn combat boots by the door, the one she'd worn at Bagram, caked with desert sand and things that wouldn't wash out, the boots that had run between dying Marines and whatever intervention might save them, the boots that were supposed to stay in the past, the boots that seemed to be accusing her of abandonment now. That's where her son found her 20 minutes later, his key in the lock, home early from school. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and saw her sitting in the dark with tears streaming down her face, and he said, "Mom, what happened?" But Rachel couldn't answer. She couldn't explain that saving a life had cost everything, that she'd violated every protocol of invisibility, that the woman in boots by the door was the same woman sitting at this table, and they were supposed to be different people. Her son waited for an answer that didn't come. The kitchen was dark except for the light bleeding through the window from the parking lot, and Rachel sat motionless at the table, her hands flat against the wood like she was trying to press herself into the floor. The combat boots stood upright by the door where she'd placed them that morning, laces still tied together, a relic from a version of her life she'd promised herself was finished. "Mom." He stepped closer, his school backpack still slung across one shoulder. 14 years old and smart enough to know that his mother didn't cry, not since his father died, not during the deployments, not through 2 surgical rotations at forward operating bases where the only choice was to keep moving. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the sound of someone's entire architecture collapsing at once. "What happened at the hospital?" Rachel looked up at him, and something in her face shifted, not breaking, never breaking in public or in front of her son, but closing. A shutter coming down. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. The words felt like copper in her mouth. "I forgot who I'm supposed to be." He set his backpack down slowly and sat across from her at the table, waiting. He'd learned patience from her, the kind that comes from understanding that sometimes the most important information arrives in silence. The hours between her termination in the parking lot and this moment had felt like drowning on dry land. Prescott had done his work with surgical precision, and Rachel recognized the signature because she'd seen it before in combat situations where logistics became a weapon. He'd filed his incident report within the first hour after the trauma patient stabilized, citing an authorized invasive procedure, invoking Section 4.7.2 of Valley Memorial's Policy Manual, a rarely enforced regulation that required dual physician approval for any needle decompression performed outside of operating room conditions. The policy existed because administrators feared liability. Prescott weaponized it because he feared being wrong. By 10 a.m., he'd cross-referenced her personnel file, highlighting her temp status in bold, noting her lack of Colorado-specific nursing certifications, attaching her hire date to a memo that questioned whether temporary staffing should have access to critical procedures. He documented the hire date as if it were a diagnosis. By 2 p.m., he'd built a documentation trail thick enough to bury someone. Time-stamped photographs of her patient chart notations. A memo from the ER nurse supervisor, one of his allies, questioning her familiarity with protocol. A statement from the respiratory therapist claiming he wasn't aware of her planned intervention. Every page was formatted correctly. Every citation was accurate. Every single piece of evidence was a lie wrapped in hospital policy. The hospital's legal counsel had reviewed it by 4:47 p.m. Administration had called Rachel into a basement office by 5:15 p.m. By 5:30 p.m., she was standing in the parking lot with Prescott's words still echoing in her ears, "You're a nurse, Torres, not a surgeon. You don't get to play hero." He'd said it loud enough for 2 orderlies and a security guard to hear. He'd said it like she'd stolen something. Like saving a life was theft. The drive home had taken 23 minutes, and she'd spent every one of them not shaking, not crying, not letting the rage become something that would crash the car. Muscle memory from Bagram took over, the kind of control that kept you functional when the world was coming apart. Hand steady on the wheel. Eyes on the road. Breathing in counts of 4. The traffic on I-25 moved around her like water around a stone, and she felt nothing except the weight of having failed at the one thing she'd sworn to accomplish, disappearing. Now she sat at her kitchen table, and the combat boots by the door seemed to mock her. Those boots had walked through 18 hours of triage during the siege of Sanjin Valley in 2011, had pressed into sand at FOB Shank, had moved through Bagram's trauma ward with a kind of authority that came from having seen the worst of what human bodies could endure and still save some of them. She'd retired those boots. She'd retired the woman who wore them. And in one 30-second emergency, that woman had come back to life, had blown through every protocol of invisibility, and had cost herself everything. "I saved someone's life," Rachel said to her son, and her voice didn't waver, but something in her chest did, something deep that hurt like shrapnel working its way through muscle. "And I got fired for it." Her son's face cycled through confusion to understanding to something darker, the kind of anger that comes from watching someone you love be destroyed for doing the right thing. He was old enough to understand that the world sometimes punishes decency. He was still young enough to be shocked by it. "That's not fair," he said, and the words were so inadequate, so purely 14-year-old that Rachel almost smiled. Almost. "No," she agreed. "It's not." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Outside, the Denver evening was cooling, wind picking up from the mountains, and Rachel could hear the traffic on the distant highway, could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind her, could hear her own heartbeat, which refused to accelerate even now, even after everything. The training ran too deep. You didn't survive combat medicine by panicking when the worst happened. You survived by accepting that the worst was the only thing that was ever guaranteed. Her son reached across the table and took her hand, and Rachel didn't pull away. She held it, felt the warmth of him, this child she'd tried so hard to protect by being invisible, by being less, by folding herself down into the shape of someone temporary. The irony was sharp enough to cut. She'd thought if she stayed small, she could keep him safe. She'd thought if she was just a nurse, just a temp, just someone without credentials or history or weight, then her past wouldn't touch him. Then the woman who'd held dying Marines in her hands wouldn't have to exist at all. But the woman was still there. She'd always been there. And the moment she'd reached for that 14-gauge needle, the moment her hands had moved on their own because they remembered what to do when someone was dying, she'd betrayed every rule she'd set for herself. "I'm going to need to find a new job," Rachel said, and heard how steady her voice was, how level, as if they were discussing the weather. "It might take a few weeks. We'll be fine for that long. I have savings." "What are you going to do?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer, that he'd been waiting for this moment in the way that children wait for the other shoe to drop after they've already heard it leave your foot. Rachel looked at the combat boots by the door, laces still tied together, still waiting after all these years to be worn again. She thought about Bagram, about the 847 surgical cases she'd managed during that deployment, about the Marines she'd sent back to their units because she wouldn't let them die. She thought about all the ways she'd tried to become someone else and how thoroughly that had failed. "I don't know yet," she said, and it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't quite the truth either. What she didn't tell him was that her phone had already buzzed twice while she was driving home. Unknown numbers. Numbers that started with 202, which meant Washington, D.C. Numbers that meant someone in uniform was trying to reach her, and whoever it was had access to her personal cell phone, which meant someone in the command structure knew exactly who she was and what she'd done and how to find her when the moment came. She didn't tell him that saving a life in the ER was different from saving a life in theater, but not in the way Prescott thought. In theater, you saved lives because you were trained for it. In the ER, you saved lives because you couldn't do anything else. Both were reflexive. Both were automatic. Both were exactly who she was, no matter how hard she tried to be someone else. The boots waited by the door like a summons she couldn't refuse and didn't want to accept. "Come on," Rachel said to her son, standing from the table. "We'll figure this out. We always do." But her eye stayed on those boots, and her hands were already becoming fists, and somewhere in the distance, a phone was about to ring again, and this time she knew she would answer. "Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already."